So I'll be recording this session. Gertrude is Research Fellow and Lecturer at the University of Zambia's Institute for Economic and Social Research. She has over 25 years of experience in the Africa region in policy and strategy development, as well as regional and urban development and environmental sustainability and the living environment. She has been delivering and managing projects as well as been doing research and development. In the past, Gertrude has worked as a senior program officer for the Policy and Program Coordination Department in the UNEP's Regional Office for Africa in Nairobi. She's also been the Chief Technical Advisor for the Development Cooperation and Resource Mobilization in the Southern African Development Community in Botswana. She's also been the Portfolio Coordinator for the Netherlands program, which has been based in Tanzania, and she was the Regional Director for Africa. And the head of the Africa Secretariat of the International Council in Johannesburg. She's also worked with the Regional Information Center on Local Governance as regional coordinator, where she was based in Harare in Zimbabwe and was with the Development Bank of Zambia in Lusaka. At present, she is visiting lecturer and she also researches at various higher learning institutions in the region. And today she's talking to us from Lusaka. So over to you, Gertrude, and I'll quickly just share the presentation. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, okay. So, okay, good morning, everyone. This is Gertrude from Lusaka. And I'm going to talk to you about open spaces, bringing back the wild into city open spaces. Yeah, open spaces. This has been a thorny issue, especially in a lot of developing countries, where open spaces are slowly disappearing, which is not a good thing for the built environment and for people's health as well. So my first slide is just going to talk about what are open spaces. Open spaces are pieces of land within a development designated most of the time for a purpose. They play an important role in our society by providing places for exercise, quiet, reflection, children's play, and organized sport. And as our communities grow and change, greater attention needs to be placed on planning our open spaces to ensure that they meet our current and future needs, especially in countries where there's been a lot of the COVID-19. I don't know about Australia, but you are luckier than the most. Open spaces have been found to be very useful, also to be very soothing for the people that are recovering from the pandemic. Open spaces also provide the city with an opportunity to experience the wild. They should be planned for in any city development. And in the earlier town planning days or city planning days, open spaces were always planned for, and these were left out even in future development. And the city authorities made sure that the open spaces were never really touched, because they were reservoirs for biodiversity and also for some ecological benefits. What are the next slide, the types of open spaces? There are many types of open spaces, and I just have a list here. Trails, especially in big cities, city dwellers can go somewhere where they can walk around a small forest or just a small open area with trees, different types of plants, small animals sometimes, small dams or lakes where people can just walk as nature trails. Wetlands and wetlands in most cities were left. You are not allowed, according to city planning rules and regulations. You're not supposed to build in the wetlands. These are usually left out in most cities and in most development. River corridors, and I'm sure you know why river corridors, you are not supposed to build in river corridors and in wetlands. Floodplains, where you have them. Some cities do have them. You also have ridges, wildlife sanctuaries and habitats, parks, vacant lots, bike paths, backyard gardens, etc., etc., scenic vistas, farmland, forests, etc., as well as buffer strips, golf courses, backyards, preserves, etc. And then what are the functions? The open spaces are natural resource protection areas. These include animal and vegetable habitats, preservation of, they are also used for the preservation of natural landscapes and habitats, outdoor recreation, passive plazas. The passive ones are plazas, sitting areas, arboretums, etc. Resource management areas, forests, fisheries, farmlands, and also some of the open spaces are used for protection of public health and safety. And these are like floodplains, wastelands, as I had explained earlier, and areas with limitations for development. These can be steep slopes, because of landslides, etc., high water tables, shallow depth to a bedrock, etc. Areas also for that shape community character or design. These are buffer strips, fonts, back and side yards, urban plazas, greenways, open space, etc. And also you have open spaces which are of a historic importance, or archaeological sites. You find these a lot, especially in some of the European countries, the old cities like Athens, etc. And I think you also have some of those in Melbourne. A battleground may be reserved. In Belgium, you have these areas where there were all these old-time battles, historic structures and grounds, historic districts, town greens, also historic gardens. These are also very important. They've been left in most countries where people can go and just learn about the history of a city or the history of a town. Why do we have to plan for the open spaces? The next slide. Open spaces are supposed to be planned for. The reason in most cases being that communities are communities mostly have to control their destiny, because they are not, they don't control their destiny because they are not in the driver's seat. You find that when you move to a new city, you find that, I think I was in Melbourne one time when the Victoria Market was supposed to be, I think, removed or something like that. And people were protesting because that's a historic kind of area where people have in Melbourne have been associated with the market for so long. And this is because people's destiny usually is not in their hands. And you find that the city authorities would like to demolish a very important historical site or a very important open space. And in some developing countries, you find that a very, very useful or a very important open space is demolished and they put in a city development like a big hotel, a shopping mall, and sometimes the people don't even have the authority to protest, or they are not organized enough to protest. This results in haphazard development, sometimes insensitive to the area's unique sense of place and belonging, and even the destruction of a natural resource, which is important to the city dwellers. Consequently, A homogenized blend of land use starts to make the areas indistinguishable from other regions of the country. People usually, as human beings, they would like to associate or to relate to a place because there's a certain landmark, and these landmarks are usually in open spaces. Very true in planning for open spaces in order to have well-designed communities rather than man-made sprawl. And if you allow your city, it can just end up into a built-up area. This has happened especially in third world cities. I don't know how many of you have watched or looked at cities like Lagos. Recently, even one big city which had a lot of open spaces in Botswana, the city of Gaborone, because of the need or the development, every open space is now built up. It's full of concrete. And in cases like that, you need a comprehensive land use planning process, which will direct where people should build for development, either commercial or residential. Also to enable communities to direct growth to these areas capable of supporting it, at the same time identify and prioritize areas worth conserving. That is why when you are about to have a city development, it's done in almost every city. It's a town planning procedure. You need to post notices so that people can object or give the city a go-ahead. And in some cases, the city mayor or the city authorities will hold a town hall for all residents to come and look at the development. This approach to land use planning places preservation of fragile and unique sites in the forefront of the designates the remaining land to be developed. So it's always good when it's the community or the city dwellers that decide where development should be done because of the importance of city spaces. That's why they are part of the planning. Open spaces are also protected based on the precise functional plan. And the city will always have a master plan which runs for a good 20, 30, or 40 years. And it's normally open to the public, so that if any open space in a maybe 10, 20, 30 years after city development is supposed to be rezoned or redesignated for something else, the city dwellers have to be told. And also we plan open spaces because they are unique, natural resources are protected, and quality development and only quality development can be undertaken in an area which has been designated as an open space. And these areas usually are sensitive to those resources, and they guarantee the quality of life, because city authorities usually have to make sure that people's quality of life is guaranteed before any open space is rezoned or redesignated to something else. We can move on to the next slide. Yeah, this slide just talks about agencies involved in the planning of open spaces. And these agencies differ from country to country. Local agencies, sometimes within a municipality or a local authority, an agency is designated to look into the planning of open spaces or the changing of the use or the function of an open space. So these agencies are involved in open space preservation or natural heritage, or it could be also a National Heritage Commission to give permission and guidelines. And the National Heritage Commission usually works together with the local authority or a local agency designated to plan open spaces. There are, in some cases, planning commissions that are set up by different agencies within a city or a municipality. There are sometimes also zoning commissions. And these zoning commissions, they develop land use regulations by dividing municipalities into districts and stipulating permitted uses, lot size, coverage, densities, and cluster development. This is important because when there's a land use plan and the land use plan designates areas for use or for functions based on the original plan of the city. The other countries have conservation commissioners. These are charged with keeping an index of all open spaces for purposes of obtaining information on the proper use of such areas. They also conduct research into the utilization and possible utilization of land areas of a municipality. And they also approve applications for programs to preserve or to restrict the use of an open space. Also, they recommend to the Planning Commission or the legislative body that plans for the use of open spaces. The involvement in open spaces activities will vary depending on the interest of their members or the public and community support. I think here I should mention that community support is very important in the planning, because without the community support, there may be problems at a future or a later date when the space is designated or it's reassigned for another use. There are also other local groups concerned with open spaces. These include land trusts, non-profit organizations, and neighborhood groups. This is usually in a case of historical sites or archaeological sites. They may have sentimental value for a group of people, or they may just have some use for a group of people within a community. In countries like Africa, you have some groups that have shrines or that perform rites in a particular built-up area, and usually a forest or a riverbed or a wetland, and they will obviously go against the development of or they'll go against any development in that open area, or they will, when planning for a new open space or opening another space, they will have something to say. So these people have to be involved in the planning. Potential players in the open space game should be aware and be sensitive to the goals and objectives of each other's goals or objectives. Why does one group value a particular open space more than another group? So this also should be taken into account when zoning or rezoning lots or pieces of land within a district, or when deciding to come up with a new development. The next slide, please. And the next slide just talks about the planning and development of open spaces. And in all cases, someone must take charge. It may be a public agency, it may be a group of community leaders, it may be different commissions set up for a purpose, or it may be a non-profit such as a land trust, or as I said, a neighborhood group, or a community or a group of people that have an interest. And also in planning or developing open spaces, there's need to create and conduct an open space community resource inventory of all open spaces. A lot of cities are developing and there's a shortage of land. Some areas don't have these problems, but rapidly expanding cities or growing cities have a problem of space. So before any planning or development of an open space, there should be an inventory. Looking at committed open land, does it belong to the federal state? Does it belong to the municipal council or a local authority? Or does it belong to individuals? There should be an inventory to look at land presently opened and used by the public, yet no guarantees will remain so for some time, because when a local authority has a shortage of land, they'll look at every empty space to put up the development. So it's up to the interest groups to make sure that the land is left as it is for the purposes of the functions that I mentioned earlier. So the development could be a golf course, a road, or some other club, a recreation camp, etc. And the experts are normally called upon to identify land which can be or which should be preserved. Also, areas unsuitable for development because of steep slopes, wetland, etc., etc. Areas that are important, for example, water recharge areas, wetlands, because you need also to preserve your natural habitat, the biodiversity, unique plants, plants that are just specific in that area. These should be preserved for future use or for future generations. Also, the inventory looks at areas that might be preserved by regulation. These are inland wetlands, floodplains, aquifers, etc. And most importantly, of late, due to issues of sustainable development and cultural diversity, cultural resources, scenic vistas or roads, stone walls, community gathering places, as I mentioned earlier, battlegrounds, things of historical value and also of cultural value need to be inventorized, so that when it comes to deciding whether to zone or to maintain the open space, decisions are based on these things. I continue also with planning and development. The next slide. The inventory also should identify the owners of the space or open land. Yeah. And also categorize the open spaces by function as in slide 4. Also in the planning and developing, there should be a review of the previous plan and the documents. These are usually in the local authority. We keep the plans of the original city plan, the developments that have been made to date, so as to see whether there are areas that are still open, where the development can be redirected if it's decided that that particular area should remain an open space or should be developed for something else. And also the inventory would help in setting objectives for the open space and also the functions. The inventory should also assist in identifying and prioritizing areas for preservation, identify the open space within a locality and also who owns that open space. The inventory also is important in prioritizing the open space according to use, and also when it comes to converting the open space plan to land use, to a land use plan, and also in setting up regulations. So open spaces normally are left just as open spaces. And later on, when they are redesignated, then a land use plan is put in place. If at some point it's decided that that open space should not remain as an open space, and then regulations are put in place. If you are going to, the local authority will then inform whoever is developing that piece of land, you should not put heavy buildings, maybe you should not put roads, you should put houses that are built in this way, or you should just use it as some temporary building complex or something, but not a permanent structure, things like that. Land use planning, and some of the problems are affecting open spaces. Of course, in countries where the next slide, please. In countries where you have inappropriate regulation, then yeah, you have a lot of problems, because sometimes open spaces are built up without any permission or without going through a process of consultation with the communities, consultation with experts, etc. And these are places or areas where the regulation is inappropriate. This is more so in developing countries. There's an element of cutting corners where permission is probably sought from one official within the local authority, and a development can be put up. A shopping mall can appear even on a heritage site. And the person putting up the development will come up with planning permission or building permission without having gone through a stakeholder consultation or any community approval. Inadequate information. Sometimes people will want to build on a site which is designated as an open space because they have no idea of the importance of that open space to the community. For them, it's a commercial venture and it has to go on. Inadequate infrastructure capacity. In cases where you have to put up special buildings or reinforce a building or something like that, and because people normally who put up development sites, they don't want to spend money. So they will do something which is not as good or appropriate for a particular site, which maybe was originally an open space for a particular function, because they have inadequate infrastructure knowledge, capacity, or even knowledge of what kind of structure should be in this particular place. Inappropriate pricing and taxation, because open spaces normally, if you want to put up a development, they should be very, very expensive because these are areas which had an original function. So if the local authority is going to sell or dispose of the open space, they obviously have to charge slightly more and price it slightly higher. So in cases where this is not done, then anybody can do whatever they want on that open space, which is in most cases a public good or a public property, communal property. It belongs to every member of that community. And also weak institutions. If the planning authority is weak, anyone can get away with anything. And this happens in areas where there's a lot of corruption and there's no accountability. So you find that planning permission, building permission is given, or demarcation or reassignment permission is given, reassignment of a function permission is given, or change of use of property or of space, of land is given to an individual or to a company without proper procedures and without a proper inventory. And the community loses a very important open space, maybe a park or something like that, or part of a very important or useful open space to the community is cut up and half of it is sold off. Uncoordinated actions in the land market. Also, this is one of the problems where the land is sold off without checking what the original use of that piece of land is. Neglect of sensitive land and cultural resources. This happens a lot. Maybe when you have a minority group within a community and the minority group might not have a very strong voice. So where they may have an important shrine or is an important meeting place or a place which is of cultural value to a minority group, they may be overruled and that land is redesignated for another faction or another use. Mismanagement also of prime agricultural land. This happens a lot, especially when a city is now encroaching onto a rural area. Cities are slowly expanding. So the original farmlands are now being converted into residential areas or shopping malls or becoming part of a city development. And some of these areas are very prime agricultural lands. Excessive urban sprawl. This happens in a lot of places because the cities don't have space anymore. There's a housing shortage, and the best thing or the next thing that should be done is to make sure that whatever available space is used for the utilization of the urban dweller. And why should we protect open spaces? This is the next slide. We have to protect open spaces because these are priority reserves. If we didn't have open spaces like inner city zoos, we didn't have botanical gardens within the city, we didn't have a small zoo or an animal sanctuary, we didn't have art galleries, we didn't have open air museums within cities, then most of our city dwellers would not have an opportunity to experience the wild. They will not have an experience to learn about the history of a city or the history of other cities, or just historical events. And these are mostly mounted on open spaces. You may have a historical fair, and this will be mounted within a park, which is an open space, and people can go and see what happened in the early years in the development of the city or in the development of the country. So open spaces are very important for also facilitating land markets, for protecting sensitive and land resources, for protecting heritage sites, for the protection of the flora and fauna, the natural biodiversity, because in the inner city zoos, you have them in Nairobi. Nairobi has one big zoo, which actually it's not even, it's a nature reserve. And it's within 10 or 15 kilometers of, within the inner city actually. And you can see all types of animals. You actually experience wild animals, or just an example of a national park where you can drive and drive and drive while you are still within the city. You don't have to go out of town. A lot of countries have inner city zoos where you can take your children to look at animals which are normally in the wild or in the outskirts of the city. And also protection of cultural resources, shrines, medicinal herbs, and also indigenous people can perform their rituals or their activities within the designated open spaces or small forests within the inner city. Also, open spaces are left within city areas to discourage the development of urban centers, built up areas. Yeah. Also, the open spaces are protected, or they are made available, or they are left within the city space to make sure that there is to encourage systemic zoning. Yeah. So during city planning of cities, or during the preparation of city plan, you always leave out open spaces, so that these spaces are left out for a reason, sometimes for future development, but the needs and functions are always outweigh development of maybe housing estates, shopping malls, schools, etc. These are also, open spaces are also important for the promotion of good health, good human health, clean air, and also refuge. There are times when, as people don't have to go out to the countryside to get fresh air or to enjoy a good scenic view. If it can be done within the inner city, this is well and good. And the next slide, just you can move on to the next slide, just gives you some of the uses. Yeah. Worldwide, you have botanical gardens. I think Melbourne has a very good botanical garden, which I always visit when I want to look at indigenous plants or just rare plants, even trees, etc. So you have these botanical gardens. In Nairobi, you have the famous Karura forest, which is within a very affluent area. And this is famous because it has all the indigenous trees. It also has a few exotic trees. You can take a nature walk Students go there to learn about plants, trees, small insects, small animals in this forest, which is in the city. It's actually right in the city center. You also have inner city zoos and animal sanctuaries. I think Lusaka here we have an animal sanctuary and an inner city zoo, which has all the big animals, lions, leopards, apart from elephants. There's also a reptile park or a reptile sanctuary. You also have arboretums. You have them in a lot of countries where trees, very old trees, are preserved and are kept in these preserved areas. Botanical museums, also very important. A national, okay, I've talked about the Nairobi National Park, which is a famous park. And some of these open spaces are also used for economic and social activities where you can have fairs, you can have all these other things where people go, whatever it is, you come up with a theme. For example, you can have, say, a particular ethnic group wants to showcase their culture. And the best place they'll go to is an open space where they can do their dances, their dress, the food fairs, and things like that. You also have, in some cases, these fairs or open spaces can be open on a particular day where you have an open market, or you have a free market, or you have a market, a culture market, or whatever, fun fair, where there's music and there's a parade, a masquerade, all these things. Sometimes art galleries are set up in the open air or open spaces. Sometimes, especially in African countries now, African cities, you have a lot of street vending in the open spaces where because of economic hardships, people cannot afford shops or stores, so they just go and sell in the open air. As long as it is organized and is properly designated by the city authorities. And the next slide also just shows some of the uses, vending in open spaces, which is common in cities where people can sell their merchandise along the road or wherever there's an open space. Botanical gardens, I'm also just showing this. On the previous slide, the bottom slide, about 6 slides, that is the Karura Forest, the forest in Nairobi. And then you have open air museums, you have open air art galleries, where the artists can go and showcase their wares and even sell. And then the next slide is just talking about how open spaces are often destroyed or just have their uses and functions not usable anymore. And usually it's man-made hazards. There could be a fire and it destroys everything that is useful within that open space. Urban encroachments, which happens a lot in rapidly growing cities. Open spaces for recreation are used now for city developments because there's a need for a hotel or there's a need for a housing estate, and then the use of an open space is disregarded. Built up areas exchange for open space, and then you lose the scenic beauty or soothing beauty, especially now in modern cities with pandemics, with climate change. There are a lot more people with mental health. And instead of driving out to a national park or an animal reserve, you can just walk around an open space. But if all these open spaces are destroyed, then we are going to have more mental health or diseases that need peace and quiet. Recreation areas, not proportional to huge city populations, parks and serene areas get overcrowded. Big cities, sometimes if you like to go to a park on a Saturday, you find that the whole city is at the park. So you don't have your quiet time. You don't have space even to sit and read your book or to meditate or whatever it is you do in a serene area. So these are areas where the populations are very, very, there were areas which are very overpopulated. So the population, the proportion is unequal. If half the city decides to go to maybe 2 or 3 parks, it means the parks will be very overpopulated. This destroys the original function of an open space. And also conversion of open spaces to urban development disturbs the natural flow of nature, where you have maybe some very rare plant species, or you have some very rare small animals or insects or things like that. You find that if people are walking up and down the open space, then they destroy all these birds. Birds don't like noise. Small animals don't like noise. When there's too much movement of human beings, animals usually retreat. And in a city sanctuary, where do they retreat to? Yeah, so they are not free to move around as they are supposed to. Insects and small animals. So this also destroys the purpose or the function of an open space. Causes like flooding. Sometimes when an area is built up, it disturbs the flow of a small river or a small stream, and then this causes overflooding. This has happened in a lot of cities. Lusaka, the city where I am, is one city which is having such problems. Nairobi also, problems of flooding because areas have been built up. Recharge areas have been blocked or somehow. And then when it rains a lot, the water has nowhere to flow. So it builds up and then the area floods. You find that the main road is flooded. Residential areas are flooded because recharge areas have been blocked or dammed or whatever. And then you also find that there's groundwater overflow and also groundwater contamination because you find that the groundwater is the water table. When it rises, and then other things like rubbish dumps, etc., they infiltrate into the groundwater, and then you get contamination. And then this also, the more you destroy your open spaces, which are supposed to have the natural habitat, then you find that there's an increased demand for natural resources and the wildlife. People don't experience within inner city open spaces, they don't experience the wildlife because the wildlife has been disturbed. And the wildlife or the natural habitat doesn't survive where there's a lot of interaction, noise, pollution, etc., because then the quiet and peace is destroyed. And then the next slide, how do we make sure that we manage and maintain the open spaces? Involvement of community is very, very important because within the community, that's where city authorities will be able to find out how the communities are using the open spaces. And it's always important to consult, to have town hall meetings, to have stakeholder consultations, etc. The next one, which is very important, is enforcing the planning regulations. Maybe this is not so much in Australia, but this is a problem in a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries, where money exchange hands for city developments that are not beneficial to communities. And then planning regulations are disregarded. Use of available planning and design regulatory instruments these should be used most of the time, things like inventories, surveys, to make sure that a designated open space should remain as such for as long as the city can manage, so that city dwellers can benefit and experience things that they would not have otherwise experienced. And zoning. Zoning has been a regulatory instrument that city planners have been using for a long, long time. Information and education. Communities have to be educated on the proper use of open spaces. And sometimes the experts, they have to be educated by the communities. Appropriate regulations and legislation. This is very important. If people are fined for building in an open space or for violating the use or function of an open space, then less violation will happen, because people will be scared of being fined, etc. Controlled urban planning and design. It's always important to control what is planned for in an urban area. Collaboration with key departments. Open spaces are normally planned or developed in consultation with different departments, not only the department designated or assigned to planning, but other departments can come in. The Ministry of Education or the Department of Education, Wildlife, Inland Water, immigration, or whatever, because they all have a part to play in the planning of open spaces. While the Ministry of Agriculture or Department of Agriculture or whatever, environment and natural resources or national restoration, cultural affairs, they have to come together and plan or just discuss as to what should be done here, or how do we manage these open spaces, or if we want to get rid of them, do we have an alternative? Is there anywhere there where we can move these open spaces, where the benefit of that open space can be accrued somewhere else, and communities have to be told that, oh, we are going to build up this area, but we are moving this particular space to another area where the same functions will be performed, or the same uses can be maintained. I think that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. That was fantastic. I think so far we've been looking in our class at rewilding, from a larger perspective. But your presentation gave us a very good idea of how rewilding can be done in inner city areas, or from a urban point of view. And I think you also talked a lot about policies and policy making, and how it can be incorporated using not just specialist mechanisms, but also people who live in the city, so everybody, even the citizens, can contribute to it. And this was very, very useful. Thank you so much for that. I would now like to invite everybody, if there are any questions or any comments, please feel free to ask. Or any comparisons, or anything that you might want to say or discuss with Gertrude. Don't be shy. No questions?
Uh-oh. Was it so uninteresting?
Sorry. I was going to say I didn't have a question, but I just thought it was quite interesting, and like you went into a lot of detail, which I thought was pretty cool, and definitely cool to talk to someone from the other side of the world and see their opinions. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. Gertrude, I did have a question. So I was wondering, when you spoke about, the planning policies, I was wondering, obviously all these planning regulations that you were telling us about so there are two ways of looking at it. One would be when a city is being designed, so right at the beginning of the city planning, when the city is new, And the other way to incorporate any of these measures would be when a city has already been designed and it's already in place, and it's probably a city that's been there for say about 100 years or even more. And then these legislations become even more difficult to sort of incorporate. So are there any ways of measuring the progress of how successful certain things that have been implemented in a city, how successful it has been? Are there any ways of measuring this, or it's a hard one to see how successful it's been done?
Yeah, I think it's very hard because, as you rightly put it, most cities have been in existence for years and years and years, and then you have the issue of population. The population is growing, and maybe the designated area for that city it's not extending as much as it should, because if you extend, maybe you are again in the next locality. So it's very difficult to measure that this city has progressed in a very good way or in a very bad way, because cities are different, localities are different. But what has happened, I think, in the year 2000, I remember, or before that, a few years before that, it was decided that we have to have international regulations for city development. And I was part of that team. And what we did was a few experts were picked up, and we went around in the different places to look at how cities are faring in the different continents. And then in coming up with the regulations that were supposed to be universal, and then benchmarks as to how a city is progressing should be the same. But to date, 20 years later, I think, there are still problems of what are the standard regulations, because cities are different. I just give you an example in Brazil. I don't know if there's anyone from Brazil in the class. You have very famous cities like Rio, whatever, very important cities. And then maybe about 70 years, I don't know how many years ago, the country decided to set up what they called a model city, Brasilia. But then when you ask the Brazilians, they said, oh, that city is so boring because it's like this and that and that. But that is what at that time the planners thought that was a model city, where you don't have to go out of your locality to shop or to do what. Everything is decentralized. And in that city, if you go around that city, there are certain things that the city placed, like it has fountains, it has all these open spaces, because they are taking into account the health of the city dwellers. And like the crowded cities, especially the coastal cities, are very crowded. People don't have anywhere. They go to the beach to dance because that's the only open space. But then the people that are used to crowded cities, they find this new city, which is a model city for the rest of the world, to be very boring. So you see how the standards are different. And you also find in different cities, maybe people from Sydney will tell you, oh, I can't go to Melbourne. Melbourne is boring because Melbourne has a lot of open spaces. Maybe Sydney doesn't. So the standards, regulations, the policies, in the end, they are different for each city. They are different for each developing town. They are different for new towns. In my country, not necessarily in my country, I think in Zimbabwe, they came up with a new policy of something they called growth points. They looked at the rural areas and they said, okay, to decongest the cities, we are going to have what we call growth points in the very remote areas. So what they did, they decided that to stop people moving from the rural areas to the urban areas, to stop the rural-urban migration, they are going to set up these growth points. So they built a clinic, a school, a shopping mall in a remote area. The idea was to stop people from moving into cities and then stop this population explosion. So it worked for a bit, and people got tired of the small rural area because it's a rural area still, even if you have all the facilities, they still move to the cities. So that particular policy didn't work for a time, and then it stopped at some point, because people, it's within human beings, you always want to get to a bigger city. I don't know, whatever happens to you, you have to, in whichever country you are in. England, you'd like to get to London just to see how it looks like, because you've heard of London as the capital city. So in Zimbabwe, that worked and still works. The migration is not as bad as before these growth points. In Tanzania, during the early years after independence, they had also this villagization. So they also took the development to the rural areas and built model villages for the people in the traditional villages. So they had these model villages where people lived, and the electricity was taken there, shops were taken there. This still works, in that infrastructure was taken there. But still, people are moving to bigger towns because it's the nature of a human being. You always want to move, to flow to an area of where you think there's more development, more diffusion of cultures. It's more heterogeneous. It's where things are happening. And then that's where you find that in other countries, they have incentives. If you remain in the rural area, you have free education, you have free medical services, because they want to keep people in these rural areas. But there's still this movement, the urge to go and see what is in the big city, or what is happening in the big city. So you find that policies, even if we have standard global policies and regulations that every local authorities has to follow in terms of developing cities, new and old, because even new old cities are being modernized, and historical sites are being what you call it, reenacted, where there was an old site or village of historical value. This is being maybe preserved so that it looks the way it used to be, maybe 200, 300 years ago, but that is still within the inner city. But still, people want to go and see the bright lights. People in the rural areas have never seen traffic lights. They've never seen street lights, and they would like to go and see and experience street lights. They would like to go and experience psychedelic lights. They would just like to go and experience traffic, which is not there in the rural areas. So you can't put standard regulations and standard policies, but globally you have guidelines, and these guidelines can be followed, but they should come from the main global guidelines, which took many years to develop, a lot of money in terms of going from one city to the next by a team of experts from different countries. I don't know if I've answered you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think a very interesting point that you made was that, people are always, looking to move from one city to another, or looking to move at bigger cities. And it's quite contradictory in the sense that you would be aware of this, it's called the well-being index of people. And, obviously it changes from place to place. And I think that is becoming very, very important, because how do you measure the well-being? And in that sense, I think open spaces have a lot to contribute towards that. But yeah, I think that was fantastic, and it really helps us to see, from planning point of view, what is it when we are looking at designing cities, what should be, important, what should be considered important, and what should be the priorities of the people planning those cities. um, yeah, anybody has any other questions? All right, great. I think that's been fantastic for us, Gertrude, and thank you so much for coming. I know it's been a very, very early morning for you, thanks to us. We could even hear the rooster cawing in the background. So yeah, it must have
Oh,
been
I
early.
have I have an open space. The rooster is actually within my yard.
Oh, lovely. Yes. So talking about urban gardens, this is what we need.
Backyard garden.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Gertrude. That was really nice and really appreciate you taking the time out for talking to us. We hope you will visit Melbourne sometime soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Gertrude.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.